of Reb Nissen's name. So we'll just start off with Zecher Nishmat Nissen Ben Yaakov Tzvi Ben Nachama Male, and we start off with the bracha at the top. Baruch Atah Adonai Olam Asher Yitzhar Hakamat Matzeva. And then we continue with the Pirkei Tehillim, which are traditional at the cemetery. Rananu tzadikim badunai laishirim navati lavodon. Ashrei hagoy asher Adonai Eloheinu ha'machal v'nachal v'mishalayim yitev ma'araz. V'mkom shem ta'ishkiel Sheker hasus l'chofer k'lid. By the way, when I prepared these, I substituted Shem Hashem with Dalet and Elokav, so just so you're aware when you're reading it, just so that we wouldn't have to treat it like Shemus afterwards. So just be aware of that when you see Shem Hashem with a Dalet. Nichtam leDavid Shamreni El ki chasinu b'chem arti l'pnai. לא תעזוב נפשי לשאול תן תסלוס. נעימות בי מנחת נצח, תפילה לדוד שמעת אדוני צדק, הקשיבה לזה. לפניך משפטי, לפעולות אדם מדבר ספסך, אני שמרתי וחס ברצם וחשב ונצח שומרני כשם בסיים בסדר דבר נוסף יופי אני בצדק החזה פניך אסבוע בהקיץ כמונתך תהילים עין בית לשלומו אלוהים משפטך למלכים לפניו יקראו צי Baruch Adonai Kalu Tfilos David Ben Yishai Tehillim Tzadi Aleph Yoshev B'Seiter Elyon B'Tzel Shaddai Yitlonan. Yipol Mitzitcha Elef Kimalacha B'Tzav Zikra Eini Ve'Aneyu Imoino Kuvitzref L'Sefer Orach V'Maspieyu V'Arei B'Shuati Orach V'Maspieyu V'Arei B'Shuati Tehillim Kuf Dalet Borchi Nafshi Ya Alu Harim Yarki Yain is a makul of enosh. We'll say you're at the more than I fear you. It's say I don't follow. Zahayam. Kula me lachari sabir makul. Ashir l'Adonai b'chayai, Zamre l'Elohai b'yodi, Yerav l'Esiti, Anochi n'esmach l'Adonai, Yitamu chatoim and aretz v'sherim odeinam barchi nafshi at Adonai, Hallelujah. Shir hamalot, we should say this responsively. Shir hamalot, b'mamakim kraticha Adonai. Adonai shema v'koli, tiena azecha kashuvot l'kol tachanunai. Im avonot tishmor ya, Adonai miyamot. Kimcha slicha leman tivarei. Kibit Adonai, Kita nafshi v'lidvaro hochalti. Nafshi l'Adonai mishomrim laboker, shomrim laboker. Yachel Yisrael el Adonai, Kim Adonai hachesed v'arbei mofedus. V'hu yifted Yisrael mikol avonotav. You want to say something before we do the psukim of his name? Before Kaddish? Before Kaddish. So why don't we just go, each person can take a paragraph. We'll do it, the person who's reading will read one verse and we'll say the other verse. Just start with the first paragraph, Nun for Nissen.
So responsibly we'll do it?
Yeah. Nishpati v'kayim l'shpa mishpatei tzikecha. Nidbot pi ritzeinu Adonai mishpatecha lamdeini. Not do Rishim pachli v'udecha. Natitu libi lasot v'chechel yolam ekev Yud. Yaakov. Yireyecha Yeruni v'yisluchu kisvacha yikolti. Yadati Adonai ki tzarech mishpatech v'emunah v'yimitani. Yina chasdecha. Yina chasdecha l'nachameini kim rotza le'atecha. Yivauni rachanacha v'yatech yidor atzai shashua. Yevoshu zeidi v'sheker yishuni ani asiyah v'zibidecha. Yashuvu v'yireyecha. Yehi libi tomim v'yireyecha v'lemahan. Dr. Schwaber. Sidri Magini Atal and Varchi Yifolti. Start Suru. Samcheni ki ratzah v'yachia. Salita kol shogim v'yad sheker shar v'chitam. Samar Nun.
Ner l'ragli dvarecha ve'or le'netivati.
Nishpati v'kayim l'shpa mishpatei tzikecha.
Na'aneti ad me'od Adonai chayeni kidvarecha.
Nidbot pi ritzeinu Adonai mishpatecha lamdeini.
נפשי בכפי תמיד, ותורתך לא שכחתי.
נטו רשעים נפשי בגדך לא טעיתי.
זכרתי עדותיך לעולם, כי ששון ליבי המה.
נתתי לבי לעשות אותך לעולם עקב.
יוד.
ידוך עשוני ויכוננוני, הביאני ולמדה מצוותיך.
יראיך יראוני וישמחו ודברכי יכולתי.
ידעתי אדוני כי צדק משפטיך ואמונה עניתני.
הנה חסדך לנחמני כי אמרתך לי עבדך.
יבוני רחמך ויחיה כי תורתך שעשועי.
יבושו זידי כי שקר יוני אני אסיף וגוגך את סיף וגודך.
ישובו לי יראיך ויודי עדותיך.
Ladies, women can participate, please. Then you want to go next?
עשיתי משוואה וצדק, פעל תניחני להשקעה.
הרוב עבדך לטובה ישמעו.
עיניי כלו לישוע שכל אמרה, צדקך.
עשה עם עבדך חסדך ועבדך למדני.
עבדך אני הבינני ועדה עדותיך.
עת לעשות לאדוני תורתך.
על כן אהבתי מצוותיך מזהב ומפז.
Lynn? Kub.
בכל לב ענני אדוני חוקך את צורה.
קראתיך שיהיה קשר
קידמתי בנשף ואשבה לדברך ייחלתי.
קידו
קולי שמע חסדך אדוני כמשפטך חייני. הרב אתה אדוני בכל מצוותיך אמת.
קדם ידעתי. Naomi? Who's next?
Danny?
Bet, Bameh.
במה יזכה נער את ערכו לשמור כי ברך.
בכל ליבי דרשתיך, גאיני מצוותיך.
בליבי צפנתי אמרתך למען לא אחטא לך.
ברוך אתה
בשפתי סיפרתי כל משפטי פיך.
בדרך עדותיך ששתי כאלכוהול.
פיקודך שיחה וביט אורחתך.
בחוקותיך שלשם לא אשכח דבריך. צדי, השי.
צדיק אתה אדוני ישר משפטך. צמצסני כנעשי כי שכחו דבריך צבאי אנוכי ונבזה פקודיך לא שכחתי. סהר ומצוק מצאוני מצוותיך אשר אשרו.
צדק עדותיך. בית, ניל.
במה יזכה נער את ערכו לשמור כי ברך. צפנתי בתיך למען לא אחטא עוד, אלא אחטא לך. בשפתי סיפרתי כל משפטי פיך.
בדרך
בפקודיך אשיך בביטה בקודך.
יוד, דיוויד שוורץ.
ידעתי אדוני כי צדיק משפטך בהונה ניתתי. ארוני רחמך והחיה כי תורתך ששוני. ישוב לי יראך ויודע עדותיך.
יהי ליבי נון, דני. נשבעתי והקיימה לשמות לשבטי צדקך.
עניתי עד מאוד, אדוני חייני כדבריך.
נדבוק פרצי אדוני משפטך למד.
נפשי בכפי תמיד בתורתך לא שכחתי. בחרתי עדותיך לעולם כי ששון ליבי המה.
עתידי ליבי לעשות סורים רדפוני חינם מדברך פחד ליבי. שקר שנאתי ותורתך אהבתי. שלום רב לי אוהבי תורתך ואין למו מכשול. שמרה נפשי עדותיך ואוהבי מאוד.
אהבתי תורתך כל היום היא שיחי עשי.
והבית את הקנאים מצוותך למדי לי.
כל מלמדי הזכרתי כי עדותיך שיחה לי.
הזכירים את אדם כי פקודך ונצרתי.
כל ערך רע, כל איסי רגלי למען אשמור דבריך.
ממשפטך לא סרתי כי אתה הראיתני.
מה נמלצו לכי כי אמרתך מדרש לפי.
לפי פקודך לקודן על פי צונאתי קורח שקר.
הריני אני דרך וככבד רנה עקר.
אביני יצא
אג'יכני בנסיב מצוותך גיבו חפצתי.
את ליבי אלוהיך.
עבר עיני מראש בדרכך חייני. עבר חרבתי אשר יגרתי כי משפטך טובה. I'm going to ask my nephew Shia, my father's only grandson who's here today, to say a couple words.
במשנה אבות, says, רבי מתי בן חרש אומר, הווה מקדים בשלום כל אדם, והווה זנב לאריות, ואל תהי ראש לשעורלם. So Rav Matya said, when you first meet people, be the first to extend greetings, and be a tail unto lions, and not a head unto foxes. So on the surface, there seems to be no relationship between these two different statements of advice by Rabbi Matya. Right? So the first statement is about what types of people you should be associated with, while the other describes a good way to behave with all people. But if you look at it more deeply, there appears to be a common thread between those two different pieces of advice. So the person who is obsessed by status will pretty much do anything to be the leader of the group, even if the group that they're leading has very little value. By contrast, the person who strives for spiritual and interpersonal growth will gladly be a follower of leaders that have very high value. So the follower of lions will end up being the bigger person than the leader of the gang with no values. Similarly, Rav Matya's second statement implies that the person focused mainly on status will not greet a new person entering the world because they perceive that person as a threat who may either equal or exceed who they are in status. The humble person would gladly greet those people because they see them as someone who has potential to add value to the first person's world, even if this means that that new person will exceed the stature of who they are at that moment. My Zaidi was a very humble and good-natured person. He always greeted the people who he met. He neither pursued honor or status, and he was always happy to be in the company of those who were externally more accomplished or more knowledgeable than he was. He was very well suited to be a long-term gabbai whose goal was essentially to give the vote to other people rather than seeking his own, and in turn he was blessed with long years and a lot of nachas from his family members. Just a quick personal memory that I have of him. Unfortunately, I wasn't fortunate to see him a lot over the last 20 years since I moved here, but when I was 14 I spent a couple of months with him actually on his farm, trucking up and down the East Coast, buying and selling cattle. One of my, let's say, last long-term memories with him. And it was not an easy period of time in my life. One of the things that I remember very distinctly about him, and I think a lot of people can as well, is how he was very short and curt in his style. And I think people often don't realize that it's not necessarily a long-winded speech about what's right and wrong and what you went through when you were a kid, but the ability to just listen, to hear what the other person has to say, to show genuine concern, and just to give a couple of words to make a difficult situation maybe a little bit less difficult. I think a lot of people could have seen that about Zaidi. May he be a Melech Yosher for all of his descendants. He may have already become one as recently, and he's a hope.
Okay, so I just want to thank everyone for coming. It's really great, Hakarat Satov, whoever made the effort to be here today. My mother and my two brothers really wanted to be here, but due to extenuating circumstances, weren't able to come. So you are all family to us, and really appreciate that you're here. Again, I also want to thank my wife Lynn for doing this with me, and for all the help she's provided and continues to provide for my family. So a little bit about this, about the tombstone that we have here, because quite a bit of thought went into it, and we discussed it quite a bit. And there are 4 pasukim, and one of the things that's in it. So the first pasuk is Ish Sameach B'Chelko, and I'm sure all of those of you who knew him realized that he had a real avas chaim. He just loved being around people. He always enjoyed himself. Never had a jealous bone in his body. Couldn't care less what anybody else had. And I always remember I had one uncle, his son is actually here today, who always had multiple cars. And I used to be enamored when I was 16 with all the cars, and my father would always say to me, "You can only drive one at a time." So that was sort of his attitude, and it didn't really matter because so what? And he was just always happy, Simchas Achayim, and it was just really good. The next pasuk is Nasav and Natan Ba'amuna, that he really conducted himself in business and in life completely honestly. He never had any stick to him. Coming from Boston, that was more common in Boston to have people without shtick, but as we've learned in other places we've been, that's not always the case. He was very proud that he had a customer who, one of his proudest accomplishments is that one of his cattle dealer, non-Jewish customers asked him to be the godfather for the guy's son. You usually don't ask somebody who you're doing business to do that. And it's funny that the reason he started as a gabbai in Maimonides, maybe some of you remember that, it bothered him that in the early days, way at the beginning, people would be called up for aliyahs and they'd shnutter, and nobody recorded it, so nobody paid. So I don't know if you remember, but he it would bother me to have to wait for him because we drove to Shul Friday night. He would go into the office after Shabbos and he'd sit there and he'd write down everybody who had the Aliyah and how much they schnuttered. I think maybe donations dropped after that because people were getting bills, but it bothered him that people were schnuttering and not really doing it. So he was very principled and honest. The next one is Hikdim Shalom Livnei Adam. That it's not that he greeted everyone but saved them time. He actually went out of his way to approach people first. There could never be a kid who walked by in Shul who he didn't stick out his hand to and make him shake his hand and say Good Shabbos to him. You know, and he searched out people. And even, you know, total strangers in Shul. When he moved to New York, he had to meet everybody, he had to talk to people. And, you know, he didn't just do it perfunctorily, he always followed up on it. So if he couldn't reach Joey for a week, he'd call me, call Gerald, see what's wrong with Joey. I said, what do you think? I've called him 3 times, he didn't call me back. If you've spoken to Jay recently, he hasn't called me back yet. Like, he wanted to know that his people that he called, that they were always, you know, around for him. And he greeted everyone. No matter how many times Michael Osborne would poke him and try and tickle him because he was very ticklish, he still, you know, said hello back to him. It didn't matter, you know, and I remember those times like that. And, you know, he really, you know, did do it. And one of the hardest times were the last couple of years during COVID, when we finally got them back up from Florida a couple of years ago, and I said, Dad, there's new rules now. Nobody's shaking hands. You can't kiss the women after show. Nobody's doing that anymore. You gotta stop. No, it's okay. I said, Dad, we're trying to keep you safe. It was before vaccines. He didn't want to hear from it, and, you know, he would stick out his hand. People wouldn't stick their hand back. I said, they're not insulting you. Nobody's doing that. The next one, Masar Nafsho L'Chanech Banav L'Torah. You know, it really was a sacrifice. You know, not all of his siblings were able to do it, and a lot of them sent their kids to public school. Yeshiva education was, you know, very expensive, but it was very important to him, even though he grew up without a formal yeshiva education. It was very important that all of his kids were able, you know, to go to school and to go to yeshiva, and he didn't have a problem with it. He when my brothers came home with their latest chumrah from Long Beach, he embraced it. It was okay. He did it. He didn't argue with them. That's not how we did things. And, you know, he really changed. His family's minhag was not to eat in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. And he, when we all told him, you know, you really need to do it, he said, okay, no problem. So he really did embrace that. And I think he was zocheh that every one of his 15 grandchildren spent at least a year in Israel studying, and now he had 34 great-grandchildren. His oldest grandchild is coming to Israel in September. His first grandchild is coming to learn. So it was really zocha that, you know, without a formal education, and that's what it said. And finally, Nolad Milas Mas. We thought that was important to put on there because that was really his essence. I mean, they came over in 1904. It was a really hard life, especially for, you know, to try and stay from, and with his great-grandfather there, who some of you remember. And even, you know, it was tough there. And they kept the minyan going, and it was a different time. My grandmother, you also remember, made Kiddush every week for everybody in the shul who was there, and nobody complained. They all did everything that they needed to do. So we thought that Millis was a great part of it, and it was important to be there. So just in sort of closing, first I need to absolutely thank Jay, who was unbelievably helpful with the whole Avaya, with this, and with making all the arrangements. There's nobody who's better equipped to handle funerals and cemeteries than Jay. Back from the days when we used to go watch Harold and Maude multiple times, for those of you who remember that. But it's been 3.5 months since my father passed away, and it's incredible how many times I say to myself, oh, I'll just call my father and ask him, whether it's fixing somebody in the house or do you remember so-and-so from Boston? His memory was like a steel drum. I mean, he remembered everybody. I thought things and he said, no, that's not how it happened. And he was usually right. And, it's amazing how many times I think of how many times I would call him. And we're just so grateful that he had a terrible accident about 15 years ago, and the 14 years that we had with him were really a bonus. My mother did an incredible job. He wasn't necessarily happy with her yelling him what he could eat, what medicines to take, but she really kept him going for all those years, and great appreciation for that. He never demanded respect from his children or from other people, but he earned it. And they all showed him an incredible amount of respect during his life, and maybe that came from the respect that he showed his own parents. When my grandmother wasn't well, he was there all the time for her, and even my grandfather in his 90s, he'd come home from a long day of work, and days were very long, and my grandfather would say, my back hurts, can you come over and rub some Bengay in my back? He'd go over there almost every night and do it. He'd come home and he'd smell from Bengay. He continued that tradition throughout his life. But maybe because of the kavod he showed for his parents. So it's sad because he had a few more good years to spend, and my niece, Shaya's sister, just got engaged last week, and she's a very, very special woman, and he would have loved to have been at that wedding and to be at the l'chaim and be in everything. So it's, it is sad. But, that's the way he lived his life, and he never passed an opportunity at a yurtzeit in shul to have a l'chaim or on Shabbos. So after we're done here, please join me at the car and we can make a bracha and have a l'chaim. Which way will it face?
This way.
This way. Yiskadel, Yiskadei, Shmei Rabba, Yomad Devrach, Yisei, Yamlech Malchusei, L'chai Chon, V'yamechon, V'chai D'chol, B'Eis Yisrael, B'Agaz Mankarev, Yimru, Amen.
Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabba, Mevorach, Mel Mayor.
Mel Mayor, Yisbarach, Yishabach, Yisrar, Yisramam, Yisnasei, Yisadar, Yisalev, Yisalol, Shmei D'Gud Shab, B'Recho, Leilam, and Kol Berchasav, Yishirasat, Yishmasav, and Echamasa, Ta'amiram, Yomad, Yimru, Amen. Yehi Shalom Rabba, Min Shemai, L'chaim, Aleinu, V'Kol Yisrael, Yimru, Amen.
Amen.
Shalom Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael V'Imru Amen.
Amen.
במעלות קדושים וטהורים, גזור הקיים הזירים, את נשמת רב ניסים בן יעקב צבי ונחמה, שהלך לעולמו. בעבור שמשפחתו ואנחנו מתפללים להזכרת נשמתו, לגן עדן תהא מנוחתו. לכן מעל הרחמים יסתירהו בסדר כנפיו לעולמים, בצרור החיים את נשמתו, לגן עדן תהא מנוחתו. אדוני מנחלתו, ינוח בשלום משכבו, ונאמר אמן.
Hakamat Matzeva.